Welcome to you all. I'm Graydon Carter, and for more than 20 years, I had the very good fortune of being Christopher's editor and friend. I think we can all agree that in addition to being a brilliant journalist, Christopher was a wit, a charmer, and above all, a bit of a scallywag. I think we can also agree that he was the beau ideal of the public intellectual. When he wrote for his readers. They felt they knew him, and they felt that he knew them. Christopher was a man of ferocious appetites for scotch, for cigarettes, and talk. That he had the output to equal what he consumed was the true miracle in the man. Christopher wrote often, constantly in fact, and right up to the end. And he wrote fast, frequently without benefit of a second draft or even corrections. You'd be hard-pressed to find a writer today who could match the volume of exquisitely crafted columns, dispatches, and books that he produced over 4 decades. He was an editor's dream, and he was a reader's dream. Despite the sorrow surrounding today's gathering, there is much to celebrate. There was, for instance, Christopher's bravery, not just in facing the illness that took him, but his courage in words and thought. He didn't mind landing outside the cozy cocoon of conventional liberal wisdom, the most notable example being his curious pro-war stance before the invasion of Iraq. We will celebrate his elevated but inclusive sense of humor, and for that legendary memory that held up even under the most liquid of late-night conditions. We will pay tribute to the people he left behind, particularly his wife Carol and his 3 children, Alexander, Sophia, and Antonio. To celebrate Christopher's monumental legacy, the hundreds of thousands of words he put on paper, we have speakers who were blessed in knowing him, both in friendship and in his work, 2 aspects of life that he was a master of. Now I'd like to introduce the first of these speakers, James Fenton.
What would the dead want from us watching from their cave? Would they have us forever howling? Would they have us rave or disfigure ourselves or be strangled like some ancient emperor's slave? None of my dead friends were emperors with such exorbitant tastes, and none of them were so vengeful as to have all their friends waste quite away in sorrow, disfigured and defaced. I think the dead would want us to weep for what they have lost. I think that our luck in continuing is what would affect them most. But time would find them generous and less self-engrossed. And time would find them generous as they used to be. And what else would they want from us but an honoured place in our memory, a favourite room, a hallowed chair, privilege and celebrity? And thus the dead might cease to grieve, and we might make amends, and there might be a pact between dead friends and living friends. What our dead friends would want from us would be such living friends.
Every time I left Christopher and Carol's place, usually late at night and always drunk, I would stop outside and marvel and tell myself, I'm Christopher Hitchens' friend. What did I do to deserve that? Shortly after his death, I was interviewed by an annoying interviewer on CNN who introduced him by saying, on the one hand, he inspired the ideals of skepticism, free inquiry, and rational thought in many, but at the same time has been called a bullying, lying, opportunistic, cynical contrarian. She said that as if it were a bad thing. Christopher was a beacon of knowledge and light in a world that constantly threatens to extinguish both. He had the courage to accept the world for just what it is, and not what we'd like it to be. And for me, that's the highest praise I can give to any intellect. Christopher understood that the universe doesn't care about our existence, our welfare, and epitomized the realization that our lives only have the meaning that we give them. For him, this came through the credo that guided his life, the courageous defense of the simple proposition that skepticism, rather than credulity, is the highest principle the human intellect can use to ennoble our existence. Whenever I spent an evening with Hitch, I came away saying, when I grow up, I want to be an intellectual. It was humbling to witness close up a mind so capable of surrounding any subject, relishing it, exploring it, critically soaking up everything that's worth knowing. He was ever ready to incorporate this lifetime of intellectual exploration along with the playful and curious excitement of a child in a candy store. He embodied the delicious possibilities of existence and the profound satisfaction that intellectual exploration and integrity can bring, especially when confronting power with knowledge, even as he bravely continued to do so with the full recognition that the possibility of a successful outcome in any such battle is slim, that stupidity, prejudice, superstition, hatred, power, and money will generally win. But beyond this, it was his unadulterated joy of the human experience, the need for irony and humor, combined with the full banquet of human knowledge that set Hitch apart. I personally remain guided by his example and often find myself asking the simple question that guides so many other people in other contexts, although I change one word, and ask myself, what would Christopher do? The last time I saw him, our discussions ranged over subjects that included the nature of nothingness, quantum mechanics, the obscenity that is capital punishment, the madness that governs the religious fanaticism infecting both sides of the Middle East, and the intellectual laziness and pretentious nonsense that encompasses so much of religious faith and theological noise in our popular culture. Christopher wasn't a scientist, and it may surprise you to know that he was fascinated by science, not merely because of its impact on human affairs, but more importantly, because of the remarkable ideas that it generates. He was wise enough to recognize that the universe is far more imaginative than we are, and he was eager to learn from the universe, as he was from the oeuvre of the world's greatest writers. On the last day I was with him, someone came to the door, and I answered it for Christopher, and the person delivered a manuscript and asked if I was his manager or his agent. I said, no, I'm his personal physicist. I can think of no greater honor. Through his questions and reflections, he extended my understanding and implications of my own work. I described to him the remarkable discovery that distant galaxies are receding from us faster all the time. The first picture is a galaxy. It's not our galaxy. Why? I just want to see if you're awake. We live in our galaxy. But in the far future, our galaxy will be alone in a seemingly dark, empty, and eternal static universe, leading likely future observers with a kind of poetic symmetry to arrive at precisely the false picture of our universe that we had 100 years ago, before the great discoveries of the last century, that there are 400 billion galaxies in an expanding universe that's 13.7 billion years old. In return, as a result, he pointed out to me an argument that I adopted in my last book, for which he was writing the foreword before he became too ill. Nothingness is headed straight towards us as fast as can be. So if someone asked that annoying religious question meant to stymie those of us who see no need for God, why is there something rather than nothing? We can shut them up by saying, just wait, there won't be for long. That idea didn't terrify him. He realized that knowledge is not to be gained for comforting our soul, but for enhancing the awareness of being alive. Christopher now has his own cosmic legacy, and I don't mean some New Age sense in which he's merged with the cosmos. Instead, out in the asteroid belt, if you could look at the next picture, between Mars and Jupiter, almost 3 times the distance between the Sun and the Earth, orbits a small asteroid, about 10 kilometers in diameter, about the size of Manhattan. Discovered in 2002 at the Lowell Observatory, it was named Hitchens 57901, CH-275 for short, and it was named after Christopher. Long after our own civilization has probably died and been forgotten, Christopher's asteroid will continue quietly orbiting the Sun until perhaps a gravitational perturbation kicks it out of a circular orbit and it heads towards the Sun, ending its life with a brilliant flame, much as Christopher ended his. And speaking of cosmic legacies, before leaving Christopher's company the very last time I saw him, in one of those poetic accidents that makes life so unexpectedly enjoyable, I was reading the newspaper at its kitchen table, and I was reading a piece about an emerging effort to ensure that young people at elite institutions like Yale preserve their Catholic upbringing while in college. When describing the temptations to depart from piety, the author wrote, "Exposed to Nietzsche, Hitchens, co-ed dorms, and beer pong, such students are likely to stray." I reflected on what a remarkable tribute this simple sentence represented. To be so culturally ubiquitous that you can be mentioned without explanation is one thing, but to be sandwiched between Nietzsche and beer pong, it's an honor very few of us can hope to achieve, and perhaps the most appropriate way that Christopher would want to be remembered. So I'll leave it at that.
So I'm Victor Navansky, and I think that the reason I've been asked to read from Christopher first was because I had the honor of initiating Christopher's coming to this country to join the nation. And I proposed to his then editor, Bruce Page, that we have the first international editors exchange in history, and that Kai Bird, who was an editor at the Nation, would move over there, and Christopher would move over here, and that if all four of us liked the arrangement, it could be extended from 3 months to 6 months, and they would live in each other's houses. They would stay on their respective payrolls, so we'd have no green cards to worry about. And that's what happened, and Christopher then defected, and the rest is history. So I was going to read from a brilliant review that Christopher wrote about the Goya exhibit in New York, but it occurred to me that, it was at the Met, that it wouldn't be doing Christopher justice if we stuck to the script, so I'm going to read from something else. Having said that, let me tell you why I was going to read from the Goya review, because there was one sentence in there which entranced me, which was, he pointed out about Goya that it was his special achievement to be a radical pessimist, to have forced our attention on the base of the ghastly aspects of human personality while not surrendering to them or ceasing to protest their official instatement. That, to me, was Christopher at his most Christopherness. Instead, what I want to read you is just 2 paragraphs. We were told to keep our readings to 3 minutes. I'm going to read you just 2 paragraphs from an article he wrote ostensibly about Rhodesia, but it actually began with his telling why Margaret Thatcher, the occasion when Margaret Thatcher famously spanked him. So here we are. The article is called "He Who Got Slapped, Lessons Maggie Taught Me" by Christopher Hitchens. I make up my mind about people in the first 10 seconds, and I very rarely change it. That's a quote. So the New York Times quoted Margaret Thatcher in saying on the day of her resignation. I would be happy to think that the statement was truthful, since within minutes of first being introduced to me, Thatcher lashed me across the buttocks with a rolled-up parliamentary order paper. It happened in the course of an exchange of views about Rhodesia in the late fall of 1977, when she was still leader of the opposition and was pandering to the racists in her party and the electorate. Influenced perhaps by the fact that we were meeting in the Rosebery Room of the House of Lords, I made the mistake of bowing as if to acknowledge some point of hers, and she took swift advantage of my posture by shrieking, "Bow lower," and plying the document above mentioned. Like the British electorate, now shaking itself after more than a decade of Thatcherite pouvoir, I often look back wistfully upon that spanking in the hope of decoding its significance. Thank you.
I'm going to be reading from one of Christopher's last and finest pieces for the magazine, a review of a volume of letters between Philip Larkin and Monica Jones, a book that Christopher said shows the civilizing effect that even the most trying woman can exert on even the most impossible man. D.J. Enright gave Larkin a rare moment of unmixed pleasure by saying, as Larkin proudly reported to Monica, that I persuade words into being poetry and don't bully them. A critic could not have approached more nearly to the core of Larkin's gift. It is inescapable that we should wonder how and why poetry manages to transmute the dross of existence into magic or gold. And the contrast in Larkin's case is an especially acute one. Having quit Belfast, he removed himself forever to Hull, a city which, in point of warmth and amenity, runs Belfast a pretty close second. Here he brooded biliously and even spitefully on his lack of privacy, the success of his happier friends, Amos and Conquest, the decline of standards at the university he served, the general bloodiness of pub lunches and academic sherry parties, the frumpy manipulativeness of womenfolk, and the petrifying imminence of death. Many of Larkin's expeditions to churches were, in fact, an excuse to visit cemeteries or memorials, in spite of his repudiation of the fantasy of immortality. And with an Arundel tomb, it turns out he had taken Monica along as a companion. We might agree to find it heartening that, in consequence of a dead average Middle English Sunday stroll, as the other half of an almost passionless relationship, Philip Larkin should notice the awkwardly conjoined couple on an ancient stone coffin lid, and, without forcing, let alone bullying the language, still be able to find our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love.
I'm going to read from Christopher's 2004 essay on Marcel Proust, entitled The Acutest Ear in Paris. I have not been able to discover whether there exists a precise French equivalent for the common Anglo-American expression, killing time. He later added in a footnote, when this piece was republished in Love, Poverty and War, I should have looked further. Baudelaire employs the term in precisely that way in his prose poem, Le Galant Tireur. And if ever a tireur was galant, it was Christopher. It's a very crass and breezy expression when you ponder it for a moment, considering that time, after all, is killing us. Marcel Proust was the man who, by contemplating in a way that transcended the moment, attempted to interpenetrate these two forbidding alternatives. When the Monty Python gang acted out its Summarize Proust competition, one of the contestant teams, a madrigal group, was cut off abruptly by the master of ceremonies before it had got beyond the opening stave of Swan's Way. One can readily appreciate the difficulty. Yet, if I were asked to summarize the achievement of Proust, I should reply as dauntlessly as I dared that his is the work par excellence that exposes and clarifies the springs of human motivation. Through his eyes we see what actuates the dandy and the lover and the grandee and the hypocrite and the poseur, with a transparency unexampled except in Shakespeare or George Eliot. And this ability, so piercing and at times even alarming, is not mere knowingness. It is not, in other words, the product of cynicism. To be so perceptive and yet so innocent, that, in a phrase, is the achievement of Proust. Thank you.
I'm Amy Bell, Christopher's editor at Vanity Fair, and this is from his 3-part series on the limits of self-improvement. I'd noticed a touch of decline here and there, but one puts these things down to Anno Domini and the acquirement of seniority. A bit of a stomach gives a chap a position in society. A glass of refreshment, in my view, never hurt anybody. This walking business is overrated. I mastered the art of doing it when I was quite small. And in any case, what are taxis for? Smoking is a vice, I will admit, but one has to have a hobby. Nonetheless, when my friends at this magazine formed up and said they would pay good money to stop having to look at me in my current shape, I agreed to a course of rehabilitation. There now exists a whole microeconomy dedicated to the proposition that a makeover is feasible, or, in other words, to disprove Scott Fitzgerald's dictum that there are no second acts in American lives. Objectives: to drop down from the current 185 pounds, to improve the tone of the skin and muscles, to wheeze less, to enhance the hunched and round-shouldered posture, to give some thought to the hair and fur questions. More emphasis perhaps in the right places and less in the wrong ones. To sharpen up the tailoring, to lessen the booze intake, and to make the smile, which currently looks like a handful of mixed nuts, a little less scary to children.
This is from Christopher's final article for Vanity Fair. It's on Charles Dickens. Charming, is it not? Seductive even. The manner in which that somewhat over-punctuated Victorian sentence suddenly gives way and yields a deposit of freshness and gentleness and capacity of being pleased. It is all there to emphasize the one central and polar and critical point that Dickens wishes to enjoin on us all. Whatever you do, hang on to your childhood. He was true to this in his fashion, both in ways that delight me and in ways that do not. He loved the idea of a birthday celebration, being lavish about it, reminding people that they were once unborn and are now launched. This is big-hearted, and we might all do a bit more of it. It would help me to forgive, perhaps just a little, the man who helped generate the hallmark birthday industry, and who, with some of his less imposing and more moistly sentimental prose scenes in A Christmas Carol, took the greatest birthday ever told and helped make it into the near Ramadan of protracted obligatory celebration, now darkening our Decembers. But imagine the power that Dickens had. By a few brilliant strokes of the pen, he revived and restored a popular festival and made it into a sort of social solidarity, a common defense against the Gradgrinds and the Bounderbys and the men who had been responsible for the misery of the hungry 40s. For the first time, the downtrodden English people were able to see a celebrity, a man of wealth and fame who was on their side. We have verbatim reports, sometimes in letters from the author himself, of the speeches he made to enthusiastic crowds in halls across the nation. Just as we have the author's cue cards for the electrifying evenings in 1869 when he staged The Murder of Nancy by Bill Sikes, so it's clear that Dickens had the sort of demagogic power that could have been dangerous in others' hands. It's also quite clear that he can't have modeled a villain like Sikes or a heroine like Nell on his own character. No, he was drawing on much wider and deeper sources of potency. The main one was the sheer stubborn existence of so many people whom the system had disregarded. Begin thinking about it, and you start to whisper a list to yourself. The pathetic Joe the crossing sweeper, Smike, Mr. Micawber, Amy Dorrit, Mr. Dick, all of them with pain to feel and a life to lead, and many of them kept going, like poor Dick Swiveller, only by a certain unique sense of humor in the absurd. Dickens was able to mine this huge resource of London life, becoming its conductor and chronicler, like nobody since Shakespeare himself, and always remembering, as he noted in the last stages of The Old Curiosity Shop, to keep the child in view.
I'm going to read the first two paragraphs and the last paragraph of a piece Christopher wrote for The Nation. Christopher was much more often arresting than arrested, but this is a piece which comes off one of the latter occasions. It was in Prague, and here he is, knowing what was coming, as he seemed so often to do, a year and a bit before the Velvet Revolution. I cherished only two modest ambitions for my visit to this capital of the mummified Baroque. The first was to be allowed to attend the legal meeting at which men and women from the human rights movements in the East and the disarmament movements in the West would be attempting to establish a common terrain. The second was to be the first writer in modern history to compose an article from Prague that did not mention Joseph K. or his equally imperishable creator. The latter ambition was repeatedly thwarted by the former. You attend a meeting in a private apartment. An introductory statement is made by a man who was once foreign minister of the Republic under Alexander Dubček, but who is now an unperson in Czechoslovakia. There is a knock on the door. Into the apartment come uniformed and plainclothes police, led by a man with eyes so close together that he could comfortably get by with a monocle. While one of his underlings sweeps the room with a video camera, he issues peremptory instructions to depart. At my request, the former foreign minister inquires politely if we may know what law has been infringed and in what respect this law contravenes the Helsinki Accords. He further inquires, on behalf of his foreign guests, if they may telephone their embassies. Neither request is exactly denied. Instead, the police official simply refuses to say on what charge or for what cause the Czechoslovaks or the foreigners are being treated in this fashion. At dusk on the Charles Bridge, small groups of young Czechs gather every night under the statues to play guitars and pass bottles of wine. They sing the forbidden 1968 songs of Marta Kubisova, and the police don't quite know what to do about it. The orders from the top and from Moscow are not as direct or as clear as they used to be. The castle still looms above the city from Radchany Hill, but it is inhabited by pygmies who were fished out of the dustbin of history and who whimper in their sleep at the thought of going back to it. Thank you.
My text today is from Hitch 22, pages XIII through XIV. These are the final paragraphs from the preface that Christopher wrote for the paperback edition to his memoir, Hitch 22. Another element of my memoir, the stupendous importance of love, friendship, and solidarity, has been made immensely more vivid to me by recent experience. I can't hope to convey the full effect of the embraces and avowals, but I can perhaps offer a crumb of counsel. If there is anybody known to you who might benefit from a letter or visit do not on any account postpone the writing or the making of it. The difference made will almost certainly be more than you have calculated. The cause of my life has been that of combating superstition, which, among other things, means confronting the dreads upon which it feeds. For some inexplicable reason, our culture regards it as normal, even creditable, for the godly to admonish those who they believe to be expiring. A whole tawdry edifice of fabricated deathbed conversions and moist devotional literature on this highly questionable assumption. Though I could have chosen to take offense at being silkily invited to jettison my convictions when in extremis, what an insult and what a non sequitur too, I was actually grateful for the heavy attention I received from the faithful. It gave my atheism, if you like, a new lease on life. It also helped me keep open a long debate to which I am proud to have contributed a little. To say that this debate would outlast me would have been true at any time. Instead of attending prayer breakfasts in my own honor on what was actually designated on the web as Pray for Hitchens Day, I have spent much of the past year registering myself as an experimental subject for various clinical trials and protocols, mainly genome-based and aimed at enlarging human knowledge and at shrinking the area of darkness and terror where cancer holds dominion. My aim here is obviously not quite disinterested, but many of the experiments are at a stage where any result will be too far in the future to be of help to me. In this book, I cite Horace Mann's injunction, until you have done something for humanity, you should be ashamed to die. So this is a modest and slight response to his challenge, to be sure, but my own. The eruption of death into my life has enabled me to express a trifle more concretely my contempt for the false consolation of religion and a belief in the centrality of science and reason. Not all my views have been vindicated, even to me. I see that I write here in this book that I personally want to do death in the active and not the passive, and to be there to look it in the eye and be doing something when it comes for me. I cannot quite sustain this jauntiness in the light of what I now know. Should the best efforts of my physician friends be unavailing, I possess a fairly clear idea of how stage 4 esophageal cancer harvests its victims. The terminal process doesn't allow for much in the way of activity or even of composed farewells, let alone stoic or Socratic departures. This is why I am so grateful to have had already a lucid interval of some length, and to have filled it with the same elements of friendship and love, and literature and the dialectic with which I hope some of this book is also animated. I wasn't born to do any of the things I set down here, but I was born to die, and this coda must be my attempt to assimilate the narrative to its conclusion. Christopher Hitchens, Washington, D.C., January 20th, 2011.
And I'm reading from the last paragraph of Why Orwell Matters. Proof, I think, that much literary criticism is self-descriptive. If it is true that le style, c'est l'homme, then what we have in the person of George Orwell is by no means the saint mentioned by V.S. Pritchett and Anthony Poe. At best, it could be asserted, even by an atheist admirer, that he took some of the supposedly Christian virtues and showed how they could be lived without piety or religious belief. It may also be hoped that, to adapt the words of Auden on the death of Yeats, time itself deals kindly with those who live by and for language. Auden added that time, with this strange excuse, would even pardon Kipling and his views. Orwell's views have been largely vindicated by time, so he need not seek any pardon on that score. But what he illustrates by his commitment to language as the partner of truth is that views do not really count, that it matters not what you think, but how you think, and that politics are relatively unimportant, while principles have a way of enduring, as do the few irreducible individuals who maintain allegiance to them.
Reading from Hitchens' piece, Why Bosnia Matters. He had written that in 92, during the war, and I visited Sarajevo in 93 in spring. We met 96, but so we were not meeting at that time, but exchanging our experiences, we became friends. For now, all these are not more than efforts to show an affirming flame, but they may not be merely quixotic. Post-communist Europe is hesitating on the brink of its own version of Balkanization, and Yugoslavia gives an inkling of what could lie ahead for more than one region, to say nothing of more than one culture. Bosnia matters because it has chosen to defend not just its own self-determination, but the values of multicultural, long evolved and mutually fruitful cohabitation. Not since Andalusia has Europe owed so much to a synthesis, which also stands as a perfect rebuke to the cynical collusion between the apparently warring fanatics. If Sarajevo goes under, then all who care for such things will have lost something precious and will curse themselves because they never knew its value while they still had it.
I've chosen one of Christopher's tart political commentaries on our leaders. This is from Slate in 2004. Ronald Reagan used to alarm his Soviet counterparts by saying that surely they'd both unite against an invasion from Mars. Ronald Reagan used to alarm other constituencies by speaking freely about end times, foreshadowed in the Bible. In the Oval Office, Ronald Reagan told Yitzhak Shamir and Simon Wiesenthal on 2 separate occasions that he himself had assisted personally at the liberation of the Nazi death camps. There was more to Ronald Reagan than that. Reagan announced that apartheid South Africa had stood beside us in every war we have ever fought, when South African leadership had been on the other side in the most recent World War. Reagan allowed Alexander Haig to greenlight the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, fired him when that went too far and led to mayhem in Beirut, and then ran away from Lebanon altogether when the Marine barracks were bombed, then, unbelievably, accused Tip O'Neill and the Democrats of scuttling. Reagan sold heavy weapons to the Iranian mullahs and lied about it, saying that all the weapons he hadn't sold them and hadn't traded for hostages in any case would, all the same, fit on a small truck. Reagan then diverted the profits of this criminal trade to an illegal war in Nicaragua and lied unceasingly about that too. Reagan then modestly let his underlings maintain that he was too dense to understand the connection between 2 impeachable crimes.
This is from Visit to a Small Planet, an essay of Christopher's that was published in Vanity Fair early in 2001. North Korea is a famine state. In the fields, you can see people picking up loose grains of rice and kernels of corn, gleaning every scrap. They look pinched and exhausted. In the few dingy restaurants in the city, and even in the few modern hotels, you can read the Pyongyang Times through the soup, or the tea, or the coffee. Morsels of inexplicable fat or gristle are served as duck. One evening I gave in and tried a bowl of dog stew, which at least tasted hearty and spicy. They wouldn't tell me the breed. But then found my appetite crucially diminished by the realization that I hadn't seen a domestic animal, not even the merest cat, in the whole time I was there. In a Pyongyang restaurant, don't ever ask for a doggy bag. Nobody knows how many North Koreans have died or are dying in the famine. Some estimates by foreign aid groups run as high as 3 million in the period from 1995 to 1998 alone. But the rotund, jowly face of Kim Il-sung still beams down contentedly from every wall, and the 58-year-old son looks as chubby as ever, even as his slenderized subjects are mustered to applaud him. Kim Jong-il, incidentally, has been made head of the party and of the army, but the office of the presidency is still eternally held by his adored and departed dad, who died on July 8, 1994 at 82. The Kim is dead. Long live the Kim. This makes North Korea the only state in the world with a dead president. What would be the right term for this? A necrocracy? A thanatocracy? A mortocracy? A mausolocracy? Anyway, grimly appropriate for a morbid system so many of whose children have died with grass in their mouths.
The last time I saw Christopher was in hospital in Washington, and we largely talked about P.G. Wodehouse, a writer we both admired and loved. This is a scathing review of, written 20 years ago, of a biography of Edwina Mountbatten by somebody called Dame Janet Morgan. It begins with a quote from Wodehouse and then from the book. Looking up, we perceived Miss Postlethwaite, our sensitive barmaid, dabbing at our eyes with a dishcloth. Sorry you were troubled, said Miss Postlethwaite, in answer to our concerned gaze, but he's just gone off to India, leaving her standing tight-lipped and dried-eyed in the moonlight outside the old manor, and our little dog has crawled up and licked her hand as if he understood and sympathized. The next is from Janet Morgan's biography. At 9:30 that evening, Edwina's body was brought to Broadlands. Commander North had asked the staff to come to the house if they wished. Everyone was there, lined up, waiting. What were they to do? He fell back on naval discipline. Off caps, he ordered as the car turned into the drive. Edwina's dog, Snippet, ran out to greet her mistress. That was the worst of all. This is Christopher now. From the very first page of this book, Sir Ernest was larger than life. To the very last, truth is stranger than fiction. The cliché is entirely sovereign. Dame Janet Morgan, who used rather to dominate in that fast set that revolved between Nuffield College, Oxford, and Whitehall, has perhaps missed her vocation in devising a biographic style that is part bureaucratic, part gossipy, and wholly deferential. This could be more happily suited to a certain genre of ladies' magazine, where one reads of resolute women with secret sorrows who sacrifice part of themselves for passionate platonic attachments to powerful men, as Edwina Mountbatten did with Nero, and as Dame Janet herself is said to have done with Caspar Weinberger. By one Washington account, making the critical difference in keeping the Falklands archipelago British. Applied to biography, let alone history, this approach can be hilariously fatal. Thank you.
Vietnam syndrome. How many times can one pretend to interview the parents of a child born with bright yellow skin? The cleft palates, the deafness, the muteness, the pretzel limbs and lolling heads, and the terrible expressions on the faces of the parents who believe that this horror can sometimes skip a generation. There is just enough knowledge for agony and remorse, in other words, but not enough for any healing process. No answer, above all, to the inescapable question: when will it stop? A rain from hell began falling about 40 years ago. Unto how many unborn generations? At a school full of children who made sign language to one another, or who couldn't sit still, or who couldn't move much at all, or who couldn't see, or who couldn't hear. I took the tour of the workshops where trades such as fishnet weaving or car repair are taught, and was then asked if I would like to say a few words through an interpreter to the assembly. I quite like a captive audience, but I didn't trust myself to say a fucking thing. Several of the children in the front row were so wizened and shrunken that they looked as though they could be my seniors. I swear to you that Jim Nakwe has taken photos, as one of his few rivals, Philip Jones Griffiths, also took photographs, that simply cannot be printed in this magazine because they would poison your sleep as they had poisoned mine. After such knowledge, as T.S. Eliot asked in Gerontium, what forgiveness? That's easy. The question of forgiveness just doesn't come up. The world has barely assimilated the new term genocide, which was coined only in the 1940s before the United States government added the fresh hell of ecocide, or mass destruction of the web of nature that connects human and animal and herbal life. I think we may owe the word's distinction to my friend Orville Schell, who wrote a near faultless essay of cool-headed and warm-hearted prose in the Old Look magazine in March 1971. At that time, even in a picture magazine, there weren't enough photographs of the crime, so his terse, mordant words had to suffice, which makes me faintly proud to be in the same profession. At some points, being naturally scrupulous about the evidence, I could only speculate. There are even reports of women giving birth to monsters, though most occurrences are not reported because of non-existent procedures of compelling statistics. Well, we know now, or at least we know better. Out of a population of perhaps 84 million Vietnamese, itself reduced several million during the war, there are as many as 1 million cases of Agent Orange affliction still on the books. Of these, the hardest to look at are the monstrous births. But we agree to forgive ourselves for this and to watch real monsters, such as Robert McNamara and Henry Kissinger, who calmly give the orders and instructions as they posture on chat shows and cash in with their memoirs. But hey, forget it. Forget it if you can.
I'm Salman Rushdie. I'm going to read a little bit from God is Not Great, a part of a chapter Christopher called A Short Digression on the Pig, or Why Heaven Hates Ham. I want to read it in part because Christopher always appreciated my story of my loss of porcine virginity. When I first arrived at boarding school in England, and rather daringly, I thought, bought a ham sandwich and ate it, and lightning failed to strike, thus proving to me once and for all that God did not exist. The oldest and most tenacious of all fetishes is the hatred and even fear of the pig. It emerged in primitive Judea and was for centuries one of the ways, the other being circumcision, by which Jews could be distinguished. Muslims appear to see nothing ironic in the adoption of this uniquely Jewish taboo. Real horror of the porcine is manifest all over the Islamic world. One good instance would be the continued prohibition of George Orwell's Animal Farm, one of the most charming and useful fables of modern times, of the reading of which Muslim schoolchildren are deprived. I have perused some of the solemn prohibition orders written by Arab education ministries, which are so stupid that they fail to notice the evil and dictatorial role played by the pigs in the story itself. Crammed together in sties, pigs tend to act swinishly, as it were, and to have noisy and nasty fights. It is not unknown for them to eat their own young, and even their own excrement, while their tendency to random and loose gallantry is often painful to the more fastidious eye. But it has often been noticed that pigs left to their own devices and granted sufficient space will keep themselves very clean, arrange little bowers, bring up families, and engage in social interaction with other pigs. The creatures also display many signs of intelligence, and it has been calculated that the crucial ratio between brain weight and body weight is almost as high with them as it is in dolphins. But the cloven hoof, or trotter, became a sign of diabolism to the fearful, and I dare say that it is easy to surmise which came first, the devil or the pig. It would be merely boring and idiotic to wonder how the designer of all things conceived such a versatile creature and then commanded his higher mammal creation to avoid it altogether or risk his eternal displeasure. But many otherwise intelligent mammals affect the belief that heaven hates ham. I hope you have now guessed by now what we know in any case, that this fine beast is one of our fairly close cousins. It shares a great deal of our DNA, and there have lately been welcome transplants of skin, heart valves, and kidneys from pigs to humans. If, which I heartily trust does not happen, a new Dr. Moreau could corrupt recent advances in cloning and create a hybrid, a pig man is widely feared as the most probable outcome. To press this a little further, one may note that if children, if left unmolested by rabbis and imams, are very drawn to pigs, especially to baby ones, and that firefighters in general do not like to eat roast pork or crackling. The barbaric vernacular word for roasted human in New Guinea and elsewhere was long pig. I have never had the relevant degustative experience myself, but it seems that we do, if eaten, taste very much like pigs. According to many ancient authorities, the attitude of early Semites to swine was one of reverence as much as disgust. The eating of pig flesh was considered as something special, even privileged and ritualistic. This mad confusion between the sacred and the profane is found in all faiths at all times. The simultaneous attraction and repulsion derived from an anthropomorphic root, the look of the pig, the taste of the pig, the dying yells of the pig, the evident intelligence of the pig, were too uncomfortably reminiscent of the human. Porcophobia and porcophilia thus probably originate in a nighttime of human sacrifice and even cannibalism, at which the holy texts often do more than hint. Nothing optional, from homosexuality to adultery, is ever made punishable unless those who do the prohibiting and exact the fierce punishment have a repressed desire to participate. As Shakespeare puts it in King Lear, the policeman who lashes the whore has a hot need to use her for the very offense for which he plies the lash. Today, ancient stupidity is upon us again. Muslim zealots in Europe are demanding that the Three Little Pigs and Miss Piggy, Winnie the Pooh's piglet, and other traditional pets and characters be removed from the innocent gaze of their children. The mirthless cretins of jihad have probably not read enough to know of the Empress of Blandings and of the Earl of Emsworth's infinitely renewable delight in the splendid pages of the incomparable author, Mr. Whiffle, The Care of the Pig. But there will be trouble when they get that far. An old statue of a wild boar in an arboretum in Middle England has already been threatened with mindless Islamic vandalism. In microcosm, this apparently trivial fetish shows how religion and faith and superstition distort our whole picture of the world.
The last email that Christopher wrote me said that he may have accomplished a few things in life, the most significant of which was surely having been my babysitter. So he was a wonderful babysitter, and he later trusted me with the lovely Antonia. I'm going to read a piece from the Boston Review from 1993 about a subject very close to my own heart, Haiti. Even though Haiti is a semi-colony of the United States and via a client military the object of daily U.S. intervention in what could be called its internal affairs, there is tremendous squeamishness about the idea of using force to secure the rights of the Haitian people. In turning tail before a single junta tugboat in mid-October 1993 and withdrawing a large U.S. Navy vessel with the touching name Harlan County without a shot being fired, the Defense Department counted on a public opinion conditioned to resent foreign entanglements. It also counted, I believe, on a certain degree of subliminal racism. The junta organized quasi-demonstrations for the cameras in which the prepared slogan, "Not another Somalia," was chanted. Before long, Robert Dole had risen in the Senate to say with maximum sententiousness that the cause of President Aristide was not worth a single American life. The Pentagon spokesman, in advance of Harlan County's mission, had been scrupulous enough to say, "One shot and we're out of there," thus tenderly apprising the Cedras junta of the low cost of defying the world's largest military machine. Confronted with a Haitian army of 7,500 men, the empire backed off. A rule of thumb is turning out to be that when the military political barons call for intervention and shows of strength, they must be distrusted for the usual reasons. But when they tell you how difficult and how complicated everything is, they must be distrusted even more. Thank you.
I'm going to be reading from one of the 3 biographies that Christopher Hitchens did. They are all very searing. This one is No One Left to Lie To, about Bill Clinton. The other one was on Mother Teresa and Henry Kissinger, and Carol Blue, working with 12, has now been able to reissue all of them again. They were out of print, so all 3 of that biographical trilogy is now available. And this is from Triangulation chapter in the Clinton book. It is told of Huey Long, contemplating a run for high office, that he summoned the big wads and donors of his great state of Louisiana and enlightened them thus: "Those of you who come in with me now will receive a big piece of the pie. Those of you who delay and commit yourselves later will receive a smaller piece of the pie. And those of you who don't come in at all will receive only good government." A touch earthy and plebeian for modern taste, perhaps, but there is no doubt that the Kingfish had a primal understanding of the essence of American politics. This essence, when distilled, consists of the manipulation of populism by elitism. That elite is most successful which can claim the heartiest allegiance of the fickle crowd and can present itself as most in touch with popular concerns, and can also anticipate the tides and pulses of opinion, can, in short, be the least apparently elitist. It's no great distance from Huey Long's robust cry of "every man a king" to the insipid inclusiveness of putting people first. But the smarter elite managers have learned in the interlude that solid, measurable pledges have to be distinguished by a reserve tag that earmarks them for the bankrollers and backers. They have also learned that it can be imprudent to promise the voters too much, unless, that is, the voters should decide that they don't deserve or expect anything. On December 10th, 1998, the Majority Counsel of the House Judiciary Committee, David Shippers, delivered one of the most remarkable speeches ever heard in the precincts. A leathery Chicago law and order Democrat, Mr. Shippers represented the old-style, big-city, blue-collar sensibility which, in the age of Democrats' light, it had been a priority for Mr. Clinton and the Sunbelt Dixiecrats to discard. The spirit of an earlier time, of a time before smoking materials had been banned from the White House, rasped from his delivery. After pedantically walking his hearers through a traditional prosecutor's review of an incorrigible perp, his address could be used in any civics class in the nation if there still was such a thing as civics classes. Mr. Shippers paused and said, The president then has lied under oath in a civil disposition, lied under oath in a criminal grand jury. He lied to the people. He lied to the cabinet. He lied to his top aides. And now he's lied under oath of the Congress of the United States. There is no one left to lie to. Poor sap, I thought as I watched this alone in an unfazed crowd on a screen at Miami Airport. On what wheezing mule did he ride into town? So sincere and so annihilating and so free from distressing sexual graphics was his forensic presentation that, when it was over, Congressman John Conyers of the Democratic caucus silkily begged leave from the chair to compliment Mr. Shipperds for his efforts. And that was that. Mr. Conyers went back to saying, as he'd said from the first, that the only person entitled to be affronted by the lie was Mrs. Clinton. 8 days later, the Democratic leadership was telling the whole House that impeachment should not be discussed while the president and the commander-in-chief was engaged in the weighty task of bombing Iraq.
I'm going to read a passage from Hitch 22 called A Short Footnote on the Grape and the Grain. There was a time when I could reckon to outperform all but the most hardened imbibers, but now I drink relatively carefully. At about midday, a decent slug of Mr. Walker's Amber Restorative, cut with Perrier water, an ideal delivery system, and no ice. At luncheon, perhaps half a bottle of red wine, not always more, but never less. Then back to the desk and ready to repeat the treatment at the evening meal. No after-dinner drinks, most especially nothing sweet, and never, ever any brandy. Nightcaps depend on how well the day went, but always the mixture as before. No mixing, no messing around with a gin here and a vodka there. Hitch, making rules about drinking can be the sign of an alcoholic, as Martin Amis once teasingly said to me. Adorno would have savored that as well. Of course, watching the clock for the start time is probably a bad sign, but here are some simple pieces of advice for the young. Don't drink on an empty stomach. The main point of the refreshment is the enhancement of food. Don't drink if you have the blues. It's a junk cure. Drink when you are in a good mood. Cheap booze is a false economy. It's not true that you shouldn't drink alone. These can be the happiest glasses you ever drank. Hangovers are another bad sign. You should not expect to be believed if you take refuge in saying you can't properly remember last night. If you really don't remember, that's an even worse sign. Avoid all narcotics. These make you more boring rather than less and are not designed, as are the grape and the grain, to enliven company. Be careful about upgrading too far to single malt scotch. When you are voyaging in rough countries, it won't easily be available. Never even think about driving a car if you have taken a drop. It's much worse to see a woman drunk than a man. I don't know quite why this is true, but it just is. Don't ever be responsible for it.
I'm going to be reading Christopher on the Arab Spring. This is from the first page of his preface to the 2001 Arguably. The three names on the dedication page belong to a Tunisian street vendor, an Egyptian restaurateur, and a Libyan husband and father. The Tunisian, Egyptian, and Libyan martyrs were not trying to take life like Muhammad Atta. They desired rather that it be lived on a higher level than that of a serf, treated as an inconvenience by a moribund oligarchy. They did not make sordid and boastful claims about how homicidal actions would earn them a place in a gross fantasy of carnal afterlife. They did not wish to inspire horse-yelling mobs tossing coffins on a sea of hysteria. In preferring a life-affirming death to a living death in life, the harbingers of the Arab Spring hope to galvanize their fellow subjects and make them aspire to be citizens. Tides will ebb, waves will recede, the landscape will turn brown and dusty again, but nothing can expel from the Arab mind the example and esprit of Tahir. Once again, it is demonstrated that people do not love their chains or their jailers, and that the aspiration for civilized life, that universal eligibility to be noble, as Saul Bellows Augie Marsh so imperishably phrases it, is proper and common to all. Thanks.
I'm proud to say a comrade of 32 years. To Christopher, publisher of his first works here in the United States, and for the last 7 years, had the honor to represent him in literary matters. And I've taken a bit from the introduction he wrote to his first volume of essays called, presciently, Prepared for the Worst. Nadine Gordimer once wrote or said that she tried to write posthumously. She did not mean that she wanted to speak from beyond the grave, a common enough authorial fantasy, but that she aimed to communicate as if she were already dead. Never mind that that ambition is axiomatically impossible of achievement, and never mind that it sounds at once rather modest and rather egotistic, to say nothing of rather gaunt. When I read it, I still thought, gosh, to write as if editors, publishers, colleagues, peers, friends, relatives, factions, reviewers, and consumers need not be consulted. To write as if supply and demand, time and place were nugatory. Call no man lucky until he is dead. But there have been moments of rare satisfaction in the often random and fragmented life of the radical freelance scribbler. Religions and states and classes and tribes and nations do not have to work or argue for their adherents and subjects. They more or less inherit them. Against this unearned patrimony, there have always been speakers and writers who embody Einstein's injunction to remember your humanity and forget the rest. It would be immodest to claim membership in this fraternity sorority, but I hope not to have done anything to outrage it. Despite the idiotic sneer that such principles are fashionable, it is always the ideas of secularism, libertarianism, internationalism, and solidarity that stand in need of reaffirmation. I feel relatively confident that neither the demand for nor the supply of the well-wrought feuilleton will ever become exhausted. We are not likely to reach a time when the need of such things as curiosity, irony, debunking, disputation, and elegy will become satisfied. For the present, we must resolve to essay, essay, and essay again.
One of the great pleasures of knowing Christopher was having him disagree with you. His contrariness, which was a word he disavowed, was joyous, and it gave rise to perhaps one of the most excellent author-bookshop exchanges there ever was. Oh, Mr. Hitchens, thank you so much for Letters to a Young Contrarian. It's a masterpiece. Why, thank you, madam. I've tried to bring my son up as a contrarian, but he just plain refuses. Christopher and I agreed on the most important things, like the greatness of W.H. Auden and the glory of P.G. Wodehouse, but we disagreed on others. Opera and cricket, for example. As you all know, Graydon sent Christopher off to be waterboarded to see if the practice was indeed a torture, and Christopher concluded that it was. I once invited him to be my guest for an Ashes Test match at Lord's Cricket Ground, and on another occasion to a performance of Lohengrin. He threatened to report me to the International Criminal Court at Hague. Even Saddam, he maintained, never went that far. But he was right on many, many, many issues. He once wrote, "The four most overrated things in the world are champagne, lobster, anal sex, and picnics." Well, 3 out of 4 there, Christopher. Another matter on which I find myself in complete alignment with Christopher, is that of the Parthenon marbles. Not the Elgin marbles, he refused ever to call them those. And this is from a 2009 Vanity Fair article. He also wrote a superb book on the subject. The great classicist A.W. Lawrence, illegitimate younger brother of the even more famously illegitimate T.E. of Arabia, once remarked of the Parthenon that it is the one building in the world which may be assessed as absolutely right. I was considering this thought the other day as I stood on top of the temple with the dedicated director of the Acropolis Restoration Service and watched the workshop that lay below and around me. Don't let me blast on too long about how absolutely heart-stopping the brilliance of these people was. But did you know, for example, that the Parthenon forms, if viewed from the sky, a perfect equilateral triangle with the Temple of Aphia on the island of Aegina and the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Sunion? Did you appreciate that each column of the Parthenon makes a very slight inward incline, so that if projected upwards into space, they would eventually steeple themselves together at a symmetrical point in the Empyrean? The rightness is located somewhere between the beauty of science and the science of beauty. The damage done by the ages to the building and by past empires and occupations cannot all be put right. But there is one desecration and dissipation and dilapidation that can at least be partially undone. Early in the 19th century, Britain's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Lord Elgin, sent a wrecking crew to the Turkish-occupied territory of Greece, where it sawed off approximately half of the adornment of the Parthenon and carried it away. As with all things Greek, there were three elements to this, the most lavish and beautiful sculptural treasury in human history. Under the direction of the artistic genius Phidias, the temple had two massive pediments decorated with the figures of Pallas Athene, Poseidon, and the gods of the sun and the moon. It then had a series of 92 high-relief panels, or metopes, depicting a succession of mythical and historical battles. The most intricate element was the frieze, carved in bas-relief, which showed the gods, the humans and animals, that made up the annual Pan-Athens procession. There were 192 equestrian warriors and auxiliaries featured, which happens to be the exact number of the city's heroes who fell at the Battle of Marathon. Experts differ on precisely what story is being told here, but the frieze was quite clearly carved as a continuous narrative, except that half the cast of that tale is still in Bloomsbury in London, having been sold well below cost by Elgin to the British government in 1816 for $2.2 million in today's currency to pay off his many debts. His original scheme had been to use the sculptures to decorate Broomhall, his rain-sodden ancestral home in Scotland, in which case they might never have been seen again. Well, I am proud to be able to tell you that I have managed to persuade, in Christopher's name and in his honour, those nice people at Intelligence Squared to host a debate on the subject of the return of the marbles later this year. It won't be the same without him, but I shall shamelessly steal arguments from his book. And I know that I will feel, as at previous occasions when we've shared a platform, that only when things go with a hitch do they go without a hitch.
We won't ever know, of course, what Keats might have written if he'd lived a little longer, or Schubert, or Mozart for that matter. But I come with my projection of what I think Hitch may have done if he'd stayed with us a little longer. As many of you know, he took his counterblast against religion, God is Not Great, not around the comfortable bookstores of coastal cities of the north, but across the Bible Belt, and challenged clerics in every town he went to enter into debate with him. And I think even he was astonished in the signing queues afterwards by the enthusiasm with which people greeted eloquent arguments for secular humanism. Now, he ended God is Not Great in the very last chapter with the lines, above all, we are in need of a renewed enlightenment. And he didn't really expand on this. But the introduction to The Portable Atheist, which was written some while after he had been on the road with God Is Not Great, gives just a hint of what was on his mind. All atheists can't live for long just being against something. They have to speak for what makes life worth living. And in a couple of conversations I had with Hitch, I felt that this was stirring in his mind, just what this renewal could be dreamed to be in the form of a book. So he says, there can be no serious ethical position based on denial or a refusal to look the facts squarely in the face. But this does not mean that we must stare into the abyss all the time. Only religion, oddly enough, has ever required us to do that. Believing then, as this religious objection implicitly concedes, that human life is actually worth living, one can combat one's natural pessimism by stoicism and by the refusal of illusion, while embellishing the scene with any of the following. There are the beauties of science and the extraordinary marvels of nature. There is the consolation and irony of philosophy. There are the infinite splendors of literature and poetry, not excluding the liturgical and devotional aspects of these, such as those found in John Donne or George Herbert. There is the grand resource of art and music and architecture, again, not excluding those elements that aspire to the sublime. In all of these pursuits, any one of them enough to absorb a lifetime, there may be found a sense of awe and magnificence that does not depend at all on any invocation of the supernatural. Indeed, nobody armed by art and culture and literature and philosophy is likely to be anything but bored and sickened by ghost stories, UFO tales, spiritualist experiences, or babblings from the beyond. One can appreciate and treasure the symmetry and grandeur of the ancient Greek Parthenon, for example, without needing any share in the cults of Athena or Eleusis, or the imperatives of Athenian imperialism, just as one may listen to Mozart or admire Chartres and Durham without any nostalgia for feudalism, monarchism, and the sale of indulgences. The whole concept of culture, indeed, may partly consist in discriminating between these things. Religion asks us to do the opposite and to preserve the ancient dreads and prohibitions. It is very often argued that religion must have some sort of potency and relevance, since it occurs so strongly at all times and in all places. Many insist that religion is so much a part of our human or animal nature that it is actually ineradicable. This, for what it is worth, is my own view. We are unlikely to cease making gods or inventing ceremonies to please them for as long as we are afraid of death or of the dark, and for as long as we persist in self-centeredness. That could be a lengthy stretch of time. However, it is just as certain that we shall continue to cast a skeptical and ironic and even witty eye on what we ourselves have invented. If religion is innate in us, then so is our doubt of it and our contempt for our own weakness.
To be part of this remembrance. Writing to a fellow author in 1889, Anton Chekhov famously declared, "One must not put a loaded rifle on the stage if no one is thinking of firing it." In this instance, the loaded rifle is the grand piano you see stage right. But it is odd indeed, in a way that only Hitch could have arranged, that I am the one who has been called to fire the Steinway gun. But first, some other ironies. Amongst the literary giants assembled here, I am a strange comrade indeed. A physician-scientist, a geneticist, privileged to have led the Human Genome Project, and now the director of the National Institutes of Health. And perhaps most ironic of all, a follower of Jesus Christ. Debates about whether science and faith could be compatible first brought Hitch and me together, and as you can imagine, we didn't exactly agree. but the emergence of a diabolically dividing cluster of malignant cells in Christopher's esophagus brought us together in a very different way. I suggested to the man of words and letters that another language, where the words are exons and the letters are DNA base pairs, might have something to offer in the search for a personalized therapeutic, a smart bomb instead of scorched earth. And so we embarked on a grand adventure together, some of which he has written about brilliantly in his powerful series of essays on the topic of cancer. The long and complex novel that was his cancer DNA genome revealed a few secrets that provided hope of a high-tech rescue. But pioneers in the frontier do not always experience the ultimate benefits themselves. We still have much to learn. Christopher helped us learn. Along the way, Hitch and I became friends, sharing conversations about life, death, science, Chesterton, Lincoln, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and many other topics. Our occasional jousting about matters of faith was invigorating. As it says in Proverbs 27, verse 17, "Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend." I'm not sure whether it would please Hitch or bug the hell out of him to know that our jousting ultimately strengthened my faith. Hitch knew I was praying for him and graciously accepted that gift from me and many others, even though he was quite sure no deity was listening. No doubt he now knows the answer to whether there is more to the spirit than nucleotides and neurotransmitters. I hope he was surprised by the answer. I hope to hear him tell about it someday, because he will tell it really well. After Hitch's death, I visited Carol and Antonia in their home near DuPont Circle in Washington. The walls seemed to be echoing Hitch's words from the many times we had met there. And before departing, I had the urge to sit at their Steinway and call upon the memories and the spirit to create some reflections of Hitch. I frankly expected something in a minor key to reflect our sense of mourning that we shared that evening. But that's not what happened. So as best as I can recall, and with what I hope will be your forgiveness for my self-taught musical skills, this is what Hitch had to say.
This is from Letters to a Young Contrarian. In a previous letter, Christopher refers to a collection of arguments written in 1908 by a Cambridge academic. It's a collection, and this is a good example. Quote, "Time is not right." He writes, "The principle of unripe time is that people should not do at the present moment what they think right at that moment, because the moment at which they think right has not yet arrived." The title of the collection is called Microcosmophilia Academica, and that sets the stage for his opening line in his letter. "I'm so glad that you like the microcosmophilia. It's a delight in itself, of course, but I keep it by me as a reminder that many questions are actually quite simple. There's a small paradox here. The job of supposed intellectuals is to combat oversimplification or reductionism, and to say, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. At least that's part of the job. However, you must have noticed how often certain complexities are introduced as a means of obfuscation. Here it becomes necessary to ply with glee the celebrated razor of old Occam, disposed of unnecessary assumptions, proclaim that actually things are less complicated than they appear, And very often, in my experience, the extraneous or irrelevant complexities are inserted when a matter of elementary justice or principle is at issue. My best illustration here would be the case of my dear friend Salman Rushdie. You would think perhaps when he was assaulted by a theocratic fatwa in 1989, his fellow authors would have rushed to his defense. Here was an open incitement for murder, accompanied by the offer of a bounty and directed at a writer of fiction who wasn't even a citizen of said theocracy. But you would have been astonished to see the amount of muttering and hanging back that went on. Had his novel been offensive, were the feelings of pious Muslims not to be considered? Was he not asking for trouble? Surely he knew what he was doing, and so forth. Several senior Western statesmen, often of the law and order and anti-terrorist school, took refuge in similar evasive formulations. In public debates with those who worried about the blasphemous or profane elements in the novel, or who said they did, I would always begin by saying, look, let's get one thing out of the way. May I assume that you are opposed without reservation to the suborning of the murder for pay of a literary figure? It was educational to see how often this assurance would be withheld or offered in a qualified form. In those cases, I would refuse to debate any further. So I was a reductionist in that instance and proud of my simple-mindedness.
Hi, I'm Alexander. Christopher was my father. And even though he chided me for using such a cliche, he was also, in many ways, my inspiration. I've chosen to read from Letters to a Young Contrarian as well, mainly because of what it means to me and to many people of my generation, and also mainly because it epitomizes one of the things he offered his friends, his family, and his fans, which was showing us not what to think, but how to think. This is from the preface. My dear X, now that it's time to launch this little paper boat into the tide, I thought I would write you a closing letter by way of beginning. While the book has been with its editors and printers, I've been occupied on several other fronts, as you know. And as a stray question of yours floated into my mind, how do I respond when I see myself or my efforts abused or misrepresented in the public prints? The brief answer is that I have become inured without becoming indifferent. I attack and criticize people myself. I have no right to expect lenience from them in return. And I don't believe those authors who say that they don't care about reviews or notices. However, it does tire me to read, time and again, reviews and notices that are based on clippings from earlier reviews and notices. Thus, there's always an early paragraph, usually written in standard form of borrowed words, that says, and this is in quotation marks, Hitchens, whose previous targets have included Mother Teresa and Princess Diana as well as Bill Clinton, now turns to ... Of course, as you guessed, this is dispiriting. For one thing, it bores me to see my supposed profession reduced to recycling. Nobody ever even has the originality to say, Hitchens, who criticized Mother Teresa for her warm endorsement of the Duvalier regime in Haiti. This is the surreptitious way in which dissenting views are marginalized or patronized to death. However, it wasn't self-pity that prompted me to write. Let me tell you what happened to me in the course of a single month between May and June of 2001, and I'll just give you one of those things that happened. At the direct request of the Vatican, I was invited to give evidence for the opposing side in the hearings on Mother Teresa's impending canonization. It was an astonishing opportunity to play devil's advocate in the literal sense.
My name's Peter Hitchens. I'm going to read the words which my brother read at our father's funeral in our home county of Hampshire in England almost 25 years ago. They are the 8th verse of the 4th chapter of St. Paul's epistle to the Philippians. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things.
Hello. I was going to read some poems, but I think I'm going to scale back. So just a quick excerpt of Christopher's words. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. That's how he would have started, and I'm sorry I can't make the grade after that. This is from Hitch 22. A map of the world that did not show utopia, said Oscar Wilde, would not be worth consulting. I used to adore that phrase, but now reflect more upon the shipwrecks and prison islands to which the quest has led. But I hope and I believe that my advancing age has not quite shamed my youth. I have actually seen more prisons broken open, more people and territory liberated, and more taboos broken and censors flouted since I let go of the idea, or at any rate the plan, of a radiant future. Those simple, ordinary propositions of the open society, especially when contrasted with the lethal simplifications of that society's sworn enemies, were all I required. I began this highly selective narrative by citing Auden on the unadvisability of being born in the first place, a view from which he quickly waltzed to Plan B. Make the most of the dance, or, as Dorothy Parker elsewhere phrased it, you might as well live. Auden wrote, dance, dance, for the figure is easy. The tune is catching and will not stop. Dance till the stars come down from the rafters. Dance, dance, dance till you drop. In my better moments, I prefer the lyrical stoicism of my friend and ally, Richard Dawkins, who never loses his sense of wonder at the sheer unlikelihood of having briefly made it on a planet where crude extinction has held sway and where the chance of being conceived, let alone safely delivered, is so infinitesimal. Thank you.
I'm Martin Amis, or Little Keith, as Hitch always called me. My dear Little Keith, he used to call me, and I used to call him my dear Hitch. The most salient and striking thing about Christopher is how widely he was loved, not just by us, family and friends, but by you. And one struggles to think of a public intellectual with a following half as passionate. I wonder why this is. There's several elements in it, I think, before I reach for the central one. First, very handsome. In a phrase he used to use, like using, handsomer than a man has the right to be. And we were both very fond of Humbert's self-description in Lolita, where he says, about halfway through the novel, I wonder if in the course of these tragic notes I have sufficiently stressed the sending quality of my striking, if perhaps somewhat brutal, good looks. Hitch wasn't, his good looks weren't brutal. They were sort of full and friendly. And my middle daughter, Fernanda, was once in the kitchen, age 5, and she said, looks like Hitch. And the man on the screen was the handsome actor, Sam Neill. I also think that his voice was very important. It was a perfect voice, without without any mannerism or any kind of poncy intonations that I can't seem to purge my own voice of. As I said, all contributing, as I told him, to the charisma of the Hitch. The Hitch has landed, he used to say on the phone when he landed at Heathrow. And when we did Charlie Rose the other night, when we remembered him, I and others, Charlie, I think, was surprised and a bit alarmed to learn that Hitch often referred to himself in the third person. This is not a habit consonant with cloudless mental health in most cases. Though the Hitch was one of the sanest people I've ever known, not always rational and by no means always prudent, but penetratingly sane. He knew who he was. And he was also something of a self-mythologizer. The Hitch was landed. When he took up the Cypriot cause, partitioned Cyprus, and he told me, he said, I'm such a good friend of the Cypriot people that when I arrive, it says on the headline in the Nicosia Morning Post, it says, Hitch flies in. And I said, what does it say when you leave? And he says Hitch flies out. Very early on, in our early 20s, I said, does that girl like the Hitch? And he said, she loves the Hitch. She wants to marry the Hitch. And another time he said, Martin, he's always coming out with phrases like this. He says, whenever there is injustice, immiseration, or oppression, the pen of the Hitch will flash from its scabbard. I've got several stories where Hitch comes out with a great line, and he didn't like this one. He said it was anticlimactic, but I'm very fond of this story, and it seems to crystallize something and lead us to what was perhaps the heart of the charisma of the Hitch. He and I were in Southampton in Long Island, having driven that far from where we were staying, in search of the most violent possible film on the island. This was our idea of happiness, was to take a bottle of whiskey into a film like Dirty Beast or Scum. Nothing could top that. Anyway, we were pathetically reduced to Wesley Snipes. And trudging rather grimly towards the cinema. And I said, no one's recognized the Hitch for at least 10 minutes. And usually he is, every few 10 or 20 yards, he's stopped by someone. And then he has a long and friendly conversation with them. And if you ever sign books with a Hitch, he would have a long and friendly conversation with everyone in his queue. Anyway, I said, 10 minutes must have gone by. And he said, longer. He said, much longer, at least 15 minutes. And he said, I get more and more pissed off, he said, the longer it goes on. He said, I keep thinking, what can they feel? What can they care? What can they know if they don't recognize the Hitch? And as we approached the cinema, there was an elderly party rather awkwardly perched on a hydrant. And as we were entering the cinema, he said, do you love us or do you hate us? Now, what he meant was America and Americans. He didn't mean him and his wife. Hitch said, I beg your pardon? He said, do you love us or do you hate us? And Hitch said, it depends on how you behave, he said, and went straight into the cinema, rather than sort of curling up with him for half an hour. I thought that was very good, but also slightly misleading, as if what Hitch did was calmly appraise the American behavior, or whatever reality you presented him with, and give it his sort of judicious appraisal, but he wasn't like that. And we wouldn't have loved him so much if he'd been like that. There are plenty of people who were like that. It was more, I think that he was bored by the phrase contrarian, but what he was an auto-contrarian. He contradicted himself, and as if Christopher felt the only person worth really arguing with was the Hitch. So we see him tie himself up in knots with supporting Ralph Nader, Bush Cheney in 2004, collusion in the impeachment of Bill Clinton, and Iraq, of course. And what people I don't see, but I think sense, is that he suffered very much from those isolations that he brought on himself. After the Clinton business, I rang him up, and I'd seen him on television looking not well, and I said, how are things? And he said, man, I'm living in a world of pain, he said. This was 2 or 3 weeks after it had broken. And he suffered very much, I think, about Iraq. He didn't talk about it, but you watched him watching the news, and when the first democratic election took place in Iraq, the excitement, sort of suppressed excitement he showed, and the misery during the Civil War period, 2005-6. He was like a Houdini, where he was right most of the time, but every now and then he would go out on a limb and he would shackle himself so dramatically that, had he escaped, or a partial escape would have been all the more amazing. And that was why he was loved, I think. He made intellection dramatic with this argument with the self. One of his favorite, I'll just end now with one of his favorite phrases was, "What could be more agreeable?" he used to say. It was one of his very English remarks. He would say it while he, I, and others settled down for 16 or 17 hours of food, drink, tobacco, and conversation. And I just want to ask, who could be more agreeable than the Hitch? And to end on a wishful note, what could be more infinitely agreeable? Imagine what it would do to your heart if the Hitch had landed and it was on his way to join us here at Cooper Union. Thank you.
In 2004, a man wrote to Christopher complaining about a column, a bullshit column in his words, that Christopher had written for The Nation. The fellow included his address and telephone number with the letter. Christopher received the note and called and left a message on the man's answering machine. For some reason, the man then wrote to me to complain about Christopher's message, which was as follows. "It's Christopher Hitchens calling you here. I get a lot of letters from uncultured idiots, as I dare say you can imagine, and I normally toss them. But I'm obliged to keep a list of letters that might be menacing, or from people who are unstable or in some clinical condition. One way I decide this is if they resort to 4-letter words and then sign it themselves. And you've just made the cut. I hope this is our last contact. But it might not be. Goodbye. Indeed, goodbye. Thank you to our speakers, to Francis and Alex, to all of you, to Carol and the kids, and to our dear friend Christopher for everything he gave to us. As Christopher and Carol's own answering machine still says, you reach Hitchens in blue, you know what to do. Goodbye, thank you. As Christopher would say, may you all thrive. Thank you.